Again, I just want to keep thanking Syngenta for sponsorship of this webinar. Without their sponsorship, it would be impossible to bring these webinars to you free of charge. So thank you very much to Syngenta. I also want to thank Joyce Latimer of Virginia Tech University. She is the person who brought all these speakers together, has been doing all the organization. I'm just the guy running the webinar, but Joyce is the one who's really been doing all the work behind the scenes over the last few weeks to get all these speakers together and put this program together. So definitely a big thank you to Joyce for putting this webinar program together. So next up we have Rick Yates from GGSPro, associated with Griffin Greenhouse Supply. Rick, I'm going to share the screen with you so that you can control things. There you go. And then let me get you your audio started too. Okay, Rick, you should have audio as well.
Great. Okay, well, thanks so much, Brian. And I want to add my kudos to the e-GRO team for doing a great job, not only in producing this webinar, but all the other materials that they produce. And if you aren't already taking advantage of the very useful e-GRO alerts by email, I strongly suggest that you look into that as well. We have about 20 minutes to cover this topic, so I'm not going to probably get to all the slides that are in the handout, but I hope that the handout will serve as a good resource going forward. Really appreciate what Rich had to say. That'd be a nice segue to some of the things that we're going to cover here in this presentation. When we're helping growers control insects and mites, whether they're using a conventional program or a biocontrol program, we find that a lot of the same integrated pest management techniques are a part of that, and we try to help growers take a little bit of a big picture view of their pest control. At some point we have to talk about the inputs we're going to make to gain control, but there's a lot of other things that go into the mix. Some growers are surprised when we're going to start off talking about crop nutrition. There's studies that show that if you have excess amounts of nitrogen in your plant tissue, that you encourage the reproductive rate of several insects and mites. And I think if enough research was done, we find that almost all insects and mites are favored by having luxury levels of nitrogen in the tissue. We also talk about things as mundane as bloom date manipulation. It's well known that thrips reproduce much more rapidly when they have an abundant food supply. So we try to do things through crop scheduling and even using plant growth regulators such as Florel to make sure we don't have crops coming into bloom long before we need them. Also, when we're talking about, when we get around to talking about inputs and using biological control agents, and I'm going to refer to them as BCAs for the rest of this presentation, we also talk about compatible pesticides. And you'll see that I put compatible in quotes, and there's a reason for that. I like to say, just how compatible are they? And this is a legend that you'll often see associated with pesticide compatibility sites and the information that they're sharing on the various pesticides. And the first thing you might notice that a product that is labeled as slightly toxic may still cause 50% mortality in the population, and even ones considered safe may take out up to a quarter of them. So we need to realize there's no free lunch here, and they really need to be treatments of last resort, much as Rich just said. And we're only really talking in this slide about lethal effects where it actually kill the biological control agent. Unfortunately, there's some sublethal effects we need to take into account also, and these aren't nearly as easily defined in the tables and the resources that we use to advise growers. A couple of years ago, Ray Cloyd wrote an article on this topic, and I thought it might be worthwhile grabbing a couple of bullet points out of there for sake of discussion. One of the things that Ray points out that some of the pesticides we use, and even some of the softer type products such as the neem-based insect growth regulators, have a repellency effect and may actually prove to be a repellent to parasitoids and predators that we're attempting to use in our pest control. And also, there's other effects, again, that are a little bit harder to measure, but may affect just how effective our biological control agents are out in the crop. It can decrease their rate of reproduction. In some cases, actually changes the sex ratio of the population, which all has a hand in just seeing just how well the biological is going to reproduce in the crop. And sometimes the chemicals, although they do not kill the parasite or the predator, they may actually diminish their ability to forage and parasitoids and so forth. It may diminish their ability to get out in the crop and find their host. So why do we even use them? I think there's some pretty good reasons, and I want to just kind of go over a couple of them real quickly. One thing that happens, and I notice with especially some of our small to medium-sized growers that do biocontrol programs, when they get closer to the warm weather in the springtime, a couple things happen. One is they get very busy, and sometimes the scouting's not quite as good as it used to be earlier in the spring, but also the reproductive rate of many of our pests are closely tied to the temperature in the greenhouse. So as we start to get those first really warm days in the spring and things start to ramp up, sometimes the aphid population can outrun the parasitoids. Now, Rich just gave a great talk on using banker plants, and that's a great way to try to avoid that from happening. But even under the best run circumstances, sometimes that will occur. So there may be a case there where you may need to come in and treat a hot spot, or as Rich was doing, just before a crop goes out the door, you have a short period of time to get it corrected, and a compatible pesticide might be a viable option. The other thing, and I think our biological control agent suppliers are doing a great job, and heaven knows they want to deliver all the product timely and in good shape, but they are talking about rearing living things and shipping them halfway across the world sometimes, and things do happen. Sometimes they show up, and due to a shipping problem, they're not as viable as they should be. We've even had crazy things such as volcanic eruption disrupt shipments of biologicals for a period of time. So those are things that are impossible to foresee. And so at a crucial time in your biocontrol program, you may need something to help fill in that gap if there's been a delay in getting the biologicals to you. Also, and this was apparently sounds like it's been mentioned a couple times today, but I want to touch on it briefly. The incoming plant material may have an unacceptably high level of pests, and this is a big concern. And in a perfect world, those infected liners go back to the producer, but that can't always happen. So sometimes we're left with a situation where we're anxious to launch our biological control program, but the level of pests on the incoming plant material is too high to make that wise, so you may decide to use a compatible pesticide to quickly knock the population down, and then the following week you come in and you release your BCAs. And at the end of the day, sometimes stuff happens, and that's unanticipated. Where's the good resources for all this information? Well, I think I could quickly sum it up and say, well, we could use a whole lot more research in this area, and my hat's off to everybody that's participating and contributing to the knowledge base that we have, but there's lots of holes in there, and we'll kind of touch on that a little bit later on. The biocontrol companies do a great job, and they put their information out on the web, and this is a great resource for us, and I'm sure it is for you as well. We gobble up every piece of information we can find coming out of the university and extension researchers that would apply to pesticide compatibility with biologicals. And I did include pesticide companies. I think that sometimes the pesticide companies are a little bit cheery and optimistic about the effects of their pesticides on BCAs, but we find most of them make good-hearted efforts, and particularly when a pesticide has just recently been released, sometimes it's really the only information we have to go on. So we weigh that in and use it wisely. I did include grower anecdotes here. This type of information is really important to us, but I also have a note. We've got to be careful with this. Growers aren't typically running really controlled experiments, so although their anecdotal evidence and their experiences are important to us, they don't carry quite the same weight as formally done research. So what are the challenges out there? Well, as I mentioned, there's just sometimes, even with some very commonly used pesticides, you'll find big gaps in the data where we just don't know what their side effects are versus certain biologicals, and that's frustrating. But again, there's not an unlimited amount of dollars to do all this testing, so we need to be grateful for all the information we do have. And sometimes when you do get data, you're not always sure how the test was performed, whether or not this was an actual greenhouse test, probably more often done on a petri dish. Well, you can imagine if a biological is being tested for compatibility in a greenhouse when there's the possibility of avoidance behaviors and the rest, then those biologicals may fare better than a test that's done on a petri dish where there's 100% contact with the insecticide. Just some things to keep in mind. And something we find a little bit frustrating when we're trying to advise growers is that when we get data, often it does not tell us whether or not the pesticide was treated as a spray or a drench or both. And sometimes there's a huge difference in the compatibility with biologicals compared to depending on how it was applied. So, and this again was also mentioned, and it's a pet peeve of ours, that we really need to have pesticide records from all the propagators out there. And I know we've got material coming from offshore, and four corners of the globe. But it is so important that we know what the pesticide history is and the plant material that's coming in. A biocontrol program can set up a great program. The grower can do everything right, and their biologicals may not establish at all if there are toxic residues still in the crop. And we do see some movement in that area, not only in reporting, but also in propagators making good faith efforts to use products with short residuals if they need to use pesticides during propagation. And as always, we're using the least toxic product we can find and the one that will give good control. And whenever we can, we just try to do spot treatments and just hit the hot spots and let the biologicals keep rolling with the rest of the program. So when it comes to identifying the compatible pesticides, I like to have growers do this when they are planning out their crop and they're planning out the biologicals they intend to release during that crop. That is when I like them to consider what compatible pesticides they would use if push comes to shove and they find that they need to do something to augment that program. Some of my friends in the trade like to poke fun at me and say that's planning to fail. I like to think that it's planning to succeed, because things do happen that are unforeseen. And if you're in the middle of a biocontrol program and the pest population is starting to get out of control, that's not a good time to start doing research on what compatible pesticides might be available to stand in the gap for you. That's information you already want to have at your fingertips so you can act quickly. And that might be the difference between saving the bio program or having to abandon it and go back to pesticides. So I like to think that's planning to succeed rather than the other way around. But other opinions are welcome. Also, we're really careful about fungicides and plant growth regulators. I'm going to get into that in a little bit, but think about it this way. If you know that your crop is likely going to need to have, let's say, a botryticide applied to it during the crop, then you're going to want to make sure that you've already checked out the botryticides you plan to use with your biologicals to determine safety. There's definitely a hit list out here. Some of these products have extremely long periods of time that they remain toxic to biological control agents. And again, if you can imagine if any of these products were used on incoming plant material, how disruptive it would be to you who's trying to establish a BCA program. And synthetic pyrethroids are sometimes favored by growers because they're considered to be of low mammalian toxicity, but that doesn't mean that they're the same way towards biologicals. In fact, they're some of the worst ones out there, and they're commonly used. I want to spend just a minute talking about biorational pesticides, because I know that the tendency is for some growers to think, well, if it's a biorational pesticide, it's most likely going to be safe for my beneficial organisms, and we want to take a look at when that's true and when it's not. And EPA just defines it pretty broadly, just something with a distinctly different mode of action and lower than typical adverse effects. But remember, that is talking about mammalian toxicity in the environment and not necessarily our biocontrol agents. There's some examples there on the slide, and you can see these are things that are often used, and we recommend them and use them as well. But I just want to point out a few things before we move on. When this is a list of some of the more commonly used biorational pesticides, and again, it's certainly not a comprehensive list, but I wanted to put a few examples down there. But when you see the ones that are now in the red font, all of these, we have at least some information that on certain biologicals they cause harm. So I guess the take-home message here is just because a product's considered to be biorational or is a biorational pesticide doesn't necessarily mean that it's got a clean bill of health with all biologicals. So you want to make sure you're researching those just like you are the other products. We talk about some of the things I think we don't often think about in terms of having compatible pesticides and biologicals. I like to use this example. Several years ago, there was a study done by Lance Osborne and Ann Chase at the University of Florida, and they were working on hibiscus, and I'm not even sure what the project was, but as a part of the project, they sprayed the hibiscus with Cycocel and noticed that the spider mite populations were suppressed for up to 6 months. And it makes me think, well, if it has that much suppression activity on spider mites, what about our predators? There's also there's a lot of research being done on this now, and I'm really glad for it. There's a study released in 2013 that studied the effects of several commonly used springtime plant growth regulators on Ophidius colmani, and there's definitely effects out there. So we have a lot to learn in this particular area, and we want to make sure that we don't jump to conclusions that PGRs are necessarily going to be safe over the top of our biocontrol program, especially when applied as a foliar spray. And also, it gets a little tricky on the charts and graphs that you see for biological control compatibility. You will see the active ingredient listed, but there's sometimes many different formulations of the same active ingredient. A really good example of the Bavaria bassiana products, probably the most well-known one is Botanigard. There's an ES formulation and a wettable powder formulation. And the wettable powder, although both of them are generally fairly safe on biologicals, the wettable powder formulation is much safer than the ES and is the treatment of choice when we have a biological control program going. And that information is not always readily available in the biocompatibility charts. And also, this might be a surprise to you, but the Millstop fungicide, which is potassium bicarbonate and considered to be safe, actually it's OMRI listed and labeled over the top of edible crops and so forth. In the state of New York, there's a supplemental label that allows Millstop to be used as an insecticide and a miticide. And that's something you might not think about. You might consider, well, certainly Millstop would be safe. Now, it's a very short residual, and I'm not saying not to use Millstop. Just beware that with fungicides, even ones we consider very safe, aren't necessarily always safe for the BCAs. And surfactants is something else where I think we need a lot more research to be done. There was one study done several years ago that was evaluating pesticides for mealybugs, and one of the entries in that study was just capsule. It's an organosilicon surfactant all by itself. And in that study, it actually controlled over half the mealybugs and did better than some of the pesticides in the trial. And capsule, like a lot of these products, has some penetrant ability that can disrupt membranes. Well, what effect, if we're adding capsule, even to a product believed to be compatible with their biologicals, what effect are we having when we add capsule to that as well? So I got to be careful. And also things to keep in mind. Now we're going to start talking about specific pesticides now, and you're going to get little snippets from the labels, and I want to just caution you that it's always the grower's responsibility to read and follow all the label directions, and we're certainly not trying to be all-inclusive with the charts and tables that are going to follow here. We used an example a little earlier about why you might need a compatible pesticide, talking about a incoming shipment of plugs or liners that had an unacceptable level of insects or mites on them. And so you might look for something that, although maybe it's toxic to biologicals over a short period of time, the residual is so short you might be able to use that and then have your biologicals come in the next week to start the program. When that happens, we like to use a combination of a horticultural oil and Botanigard, especially the Botanigard wettable powder. We like these products for a couple of reasons. One, between the combination of them, you get very broad spectrum control. The residual is very short. Within a week, it's safe to get back in there with your bios. The other thing is there's some research that was done by Michael Brownbridge several years ago, and he was looking for ways to enhance the activity of products like Botanigard that use Bavaria bassiana, and he found synergism when using horticultural oils or some of the neem-based insect growth regulators. So we feel like not only are they good products, but in combination we're getting a synergistic effect there, and a week later we can get back in with our bios. We're going to be talking about it at the end of your handout. There's some charts in there. We're going to try to give you a jump start on considering which pesticides to investigate if you need to apply them over the top of your biocontrol program based on various pests. And I thought it'd be good for you to know where the information that's in those tables, how that was derived. And what we have done is we've created a database internally, and it's continually updated as we get more information in. But we used virtually all the sources that I mentioned earlier as being good resources for the growers to put this database together. So we used the available data from the biocontrol companies. We used all the extension and research data we can get from the university, the extension people, and we also used the pesticide company information. And then we collate all that, and we kind of fuss fight over it, and we come up with what we consider to be our best advice to the growers. And what we'll do is, if there's a conflict, and there often is, between the different sources, we will go with the more pessimistic. Unless there's one data input that's clearly an outlier from the others, we'll just go with the more pessimistic of the analysis, rather to err on the side of caution rather than taking a chance. And this is just a quick snapshot of the work that we put together here, and there's an awful lot, as you can imagine, of data that goes into producing it. And the final output looks a lot like what you see on the Biocontrol website. So I do want to point out, we're not doing any individual research, original research here. We are just using all the good information that's out there, and we're trying to pull it all together and make judgments based on that, on which to advise our growers. And this is just a fun shot. This happens to be what happens when you put our chart through a blueprint printer. And we call that our pocket edition of the compatibility guide. So as we move into these charts, I thought it'd be important to point this out, that anything on this on the tables where it says S, we're referring to the safe category on the biocontrol, on the biocompatibility. But again, just a quick reminder, that could mean that we're still going to have up to 25% mortality. So we have to keep that in mind. It's not a free ticket. And since there's so much interest in growing edible crops in greenhouses these days, and often that's an epicenter of biocontrol use, or where growers start their biocontrol programs out, I thought it'd be useful to have a key on the charts to let you know the pesticides that are on there, how they are labeled. Now in this case, if the product's labeled with an H, that means that that pesticide can be used on edible crops up to the point of harvest. If it has a T, it means it can be used on the transplant stage, but not up to harvest. And of course, O means ornamentals. In all these cases, it's still on to, and behooves the grower to check that label out, because none of these products are labeled for all edible crops. So you need to find out if the crop that you wish to treat is specifically mentioned on that label as being approved. And again, although we've done our very best to compile all this material to help out the growers and to be able to give them good advice, certainly not being tested out under all conditions. And growers, just like with traditional pesticides, we say we'd like you to try them out on a small scale before you certainly treat a large area and take a chance in that way. So I'm going to jump in here and just go through a couple of these charts, and again, I hope they'll serve as a resource. We're certainly not going to cover all the material on the chart here in the next couple of minutes, but and this is a really good example. Rich was talking about aphids and what happens if you get a hot spot or that population is outrunning your program or your biocontrols. And he mentioned Endeavor, and just like Rich said, we found in the data that there is some slight toxicity out there, and so if we have our druthers, we'd like to have a week between the application of Endeavor and the biological, but there may be times that that's not possible, or better yet, we may be able to take Endeavor and just treat the hot spots in a manner that like Rich described, and not go over the entire BCA program with it. And backing up one line to the neem-based insect growth regulators, you can see there, good example over to the right, you can see how they're labeled for to harvest, to transplant, and ornamentals. That's what those codes mean. And if it's useful to you, the column on the far right lets you know whether or not that product is OMRI listed or not. Flagship is on this sheet, and I want to point out there's pay attention when we say drench only, because sometimes these products have much different BCA compatibility ratings when they're applied as a spray versus a drench, and that probably makes sense to you. That would be the case. So bear in mind that's important to check out. And you do see some question marks out there, and that means we just could not find enough data to make a good call on it. So we leave it blank, essentially. Also, Contos is a product we like a lot as a drench, and it's a great example of, as a foliar spray, it is very disruptive to the predator mites, but as a drench, unless you're using a soil-applied mite, such as hypoaspis, it's really not a problem for the predator mite, so it's a big difference there in the method of application. And again, a couple more there. Preferol, or Preferol, some people call it, is a relatively new biological, and that seems like it has, I should say, it is a naturally occurring fungus, and some growers feel very optimistic about using that with their biocontrol programs. We'll try to get more experience as the years go by. And what we try to do with growers, if they're trying to consider breaking into biocontrol for the first time, we feel like fungus gnats are a really good place to start. We just have excellent and very reliable results with that. It's a good place to get your feet wet. And in addition to the nematodes, there's other good biologicals, as you can see there. So this is a really good launching off point. And you can see, since the Atheta is a soil dweller and is feeding on the immature stages in the soil, that we got to be really careful, even with some of the insect growth regulators that might be used in conjunction with it. So if you're planning on using Atheta, you can see that it probably need to be released a couple weeks after the program starts, after the pesticide's been applied to the soil to ensure their safety. And spider mites, I do want to mention there's a really good new miticide out called Sultan, and according to the manufacturer, it's safe over Phytocilus persimilis, which we consider to be, in a lot of instances, the best predator for mites. But we don't have any collaborating information on that right now, so stay tuned. That's why it's not on the chart until we get some more data in. But it is a possibility for the future. A lot of growers like to use floor mite and shuttle over the top for limited effects against the biologicals as well. And again, Contos is a drench. You avoid that conflict altogether if that suits you. And then for thrips, after fungus gnats, I think thrips are another great success story, and maybe the next place to go when introducing growers to biocontrol is that not only are thrips very resistant to pesticides, but they are very successfully controlled by biological control agents. So we'd encourage you to take a look at that if you're not already doing it. And you can see we have a pretty good array of pesticides we can use over the top of them. I would say we've got to be really careful with Aureus, however. Most of these pesticides have at least some negative impact on Aureus, so we've got to be real careful when we're doing that. And let's see, a Contos drench, highly successful against thrips. We've got a when only applied as a drench. Overture is a product, there's not a lot of data out there, but our growers have been using it over the top of cucurbits and not reporting any negative impacts to it. So I don't have any data to back that up, but you might want to do some small scale experimenting. It's also safe on open blooms and so forth. So when your back's against the wall and you've got thrips starting to increase close to sale time, it might be one that you want to experiment with to see how that works for you. And last but not least, whiteflies. Certainly, those of you that grow poinsettias are well aware of just how difficult it is to control them with traditional pesticides. So we're getting a lot of interest on growers using biocontrol programs here. And again, we feel like there's a pretty good array of products that can be used in and around your biological control program if necessary. I think with that, I'm just about 25 after. I'll stop and see if any questions came in.
Okay, Rich. Question is the I'm not sure if this is the chart, because you showed a couple different charts. Can these charts be available to you or to the growers?
That particular chart is kind of a living document working on all the time. We'll certainly advise growers off of it, but we haven't published it. And part of the reason is it's not our own research. We are, as I mentioned, we're just doing a compilation of the hard work of others and trying to pull that information together. But more than happy to advise a grower off of our database by email or by phone. Be happy to do that.
Okay. Yeah, it looks like a lot of people want that poster.
Maybe we have to reconsider. It's a great stocking stuffer. So.
Any other questions that people have for Rich? Or Rick? I keep messing up Rich and Rick's name back to back. It's hard to keep.
Rich
them
is so handsome. Let's go with Rich.
How about is capsule safe with? I'm gonna butcher the name. Steinerema.
Steinerema. Yes, it is. Now we try not to ever, when we say something's compatible with nematodes, we never want to put nematodes in the stock tank with any of these pesticides or the surfactants. But if you're talking about applying the nematodes and then applying a pesticide with capsule in it afterwards, that is fine. But we do know that research has been done with Steinerema and capsule, and it doesn't. If you're applying it to the foliage of plants, the nematodes, then capsule has been tested that way, and it has improved coverage. It breaks surface tension of the water and spreads the droplets with the nematodes out over the surface. So that certainly would be approved, yes.
Okay. All right. Well, it doesn't look like anybody else is chiming in with any other questions, so you must have just done a fantastic job of covering everything. So, Rick, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate you participating in this webinar.
Thanks.
Okay, folks. Our next. We'll be taking another short break, about 3 minutes here, and we'll have Marjorie Daughtry coming up, and she'll be covering the fundamentals of biological control of fungal and bacterial diseases. So take a short break, and we'll be back here in about 2 or 3 minutes.